today we got a lot going on. It's very serious. Jesus saying, if you're ashamed of me, I'll be ashamed of you. If you're unashamed, I'll be unashamed, and I'll claim you in the midst of my Father. And guess what else? Peter says, you're the Christ, and he's like, oh, it's amazing. And then Peter's like thinking like a man again, and Jesus rebukes him. Oh man, what would it be like to be rebuked by Jesus? Come and read it with me. It's a fun one. Hey everybody, welcome to Bible Time. Thanks for joining me today. Craig here. We're picking up in Mark chapter 8, starting at verse 27. Peter confesses Jesus to be the Christ, the first person to ever recognize Jesus for who he is and speak it out directly. And so I'm familiar with the Matthew version. I don't pre-read any of this. I'm just reading the Bible right along with you. So I'm excited to see what it says in this version. If you're new to these videos, thank you for joining. Just want to let you know what this is, a place to read the Bible. And really, I'm not here to teach or anything like that. I do share some thoughts along the way, but really it's just like I'm just trying to help people get in the habit of reading the Bible and show you an example of what it can look like if you have a pen in your hand, of underlining and circling and engaging with the scriptures. So if you learn something along the way, I'm glad. But most importantly, I hope and pray that you kind of are spending time in your heart with God, listening to him and his word, and then giving space for the Holy Spirit to speak to you. So that being said, let's read the Bible with that in mind and through that lens. So this is what it says. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. So this is a section that's like on the far outskirts of Israel. I think it's just outside of Israel. It's a Roman city, and this Roman city its namesake is after the Caesar, Caesarea Caesar. So the Caesar Philip, and just one of the rulers of the time. And so the whole city is kind of named after this Roman Caesar ruler that in many ways they kind of declared themselves to be sort of godlike. In the city, there's also a major temple to the Greek god Pan or Pon, and there's also a major temple to the pagan or Syrian god Baal, and Baal finds himself all over the Old Testament. And so it's in this like city of deistic identity that Jesus takes his disciples to ask this question. On the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And so this is the first place that Jesus has taken the time and apparently cared to know who other people say that he is. It's an identity question. Okay? So notice that he's asking about identity, his identity, primarily. And in regards to the identity question, they're answering in the moment, what does everybody else say about you? And everybody else says, some think you're John the Baptist, which is a super weird answer because John the Baptist is Jesus' cousin who's dead and already got his head chopped off. Some people think you're Elijah, and others one of the prophets. So Elijah was a prophet that lived a long time ago, which is super weird too, other than the fact that they believed that Elijah was to come before the Messiah. And so in some ways, even though it's super weird, it kind of makes sense. One of the other prophets would almost be weirder because they're all dead and there was never any belief or any prophecy, anything that another prophet's going to raise from the dead and come back. But Elijah was supposed to come back before the Messiah. But what we know is that Jesus is the Messiah, and John the Baptist was actually in the form of Elijah preparing the way. So Jesus is not John the Baptist nor Elijah, because actually John the Baptist is Elijah and he's dead and he's not one of the other prophets. So what's interesting though is that these answers that are crazy, he doesn't even address them. It says, and he asked them, but who do you say that I am? And this really is in many ways the most important question ever asked. I mean, this is like the question that if I could only ask one question to any human being out there, I'm going to ask them, who do you really say that Jesus is? And this is the question that, in the midst of him asking about his identity for the first time, and he starts by asking, what does everybody else think? He just ignores those answers and says, in a sense, says, I don't actually care who you think other people think I am. What I'm really trying to get at is, who do you think that I am? And Peter, he answered him, you are the Christ. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Of course, we keep seeing him tell people to not tell anybody about him. And last chapter, or last section, we saw that the more he told them not to tell, the more that they told. But here's the answer. You are the Christ, the Messiah. And Peter, of course, answers that. The Matthew version in Matthew 16 has a few more details in there. In Matthew 16, Jesus then looks at Peter and says, you are blessed. First time Jesus ever said to said to somebody, you're blessed. And then he also goes on to talk about the church and building the church on the confession of Jesus' lordship, and the gates of hell will never prevail against it, and all of those awesome details. But again, as we move on from this section, I don't know who you are, and I don't know why you're watching this. My guess is you're probably a believer in Jesus, a follower of Jesus, if you're watching this. If not, and you made it onto this video somehow, it's just, number one, thanks for being here. Especially if a friend shared it with you, and maybe you're an atheist or you're skeptical, you don't know. I just want to speak to you and pose this question to you. Maybe you were hurt in church. Maybe you've been hurt by Christians. I know that happens. Maybe you just had a bad taste growing up, and parents made you go to church, or forced religion on you. I get it, but this question still remains as the most outstanding question that you have to answer. So I always like to just invite people, forget about what your thoughts are on church and religion. Just the person of Jesus. Who do you say that he is? Who do you really think that he is? Because it's the most important question that has been asked, and the most important question that we have to answer. Who do I really think Jesus of Nazareth is? C.S. Lewis says there's only three options. He's either a liar, he's a lunatic, I don't know if that's spelled right, but I'm a horrible speller, or he's Lord. One of these three options has to be true. He either knew that he wasn't God and he lied about it, and he started this whole thing even though he was lying. He's just a man and he's lying. It's plausible. He's a lunatic. He actually believed that he was God. He wasn't lying per se, he just was plumb crazy. It's plausible. Or the only other option is that he's really Lord. This idea that he was a good teacher or just a man or anything like that, it's really not possible based on what he said, what he did, his death, and whether or not he raised from the dead. And so I believe that the evidence is obviously leaning towards him being Lord and him being the definition for this entire world, the problem, the pain, and the joy, and the salvation, and all that. Jesus makes the most sense to me. And so I want to invite you to consider that. Now, all that being said, if you're still with me and you're a believer, which my guess is most of you, the only way really anybody's going to see this video probably that doesn't believe is if you share it with them. And so if you're here 9 minutes in and you follow Jesus and you believe what I'm saying, would you just consider, let's take 5 minutes and say, who in my world could I share this with, and just invite them to consider and send it to them? Would you do that? That's the only way that this word gets out, and you never know whose life you could change. So if that's you, Jesus follower, and you share this, thank you. If you are the person that this was shared with, maybe thank them, even if you don't believe, but thank them for sharing it with you. I know this, if they shared it with you, it's because they love you. So anyway, let's continue on. right? In both accounts, Matthew and Mark here, it was from that moment where they first recognized him as the Christ. It was from that moment he began to tell them what was going to happen, that he was going to die and resurrect. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Isn't that funny? Peter tries to rebuke Jesus. There's Jesus here. And then Jesus rebukes Peter. Can you imagine like trying to rebuke Jesus? And you just think that you're like really doing this thing, like, no! And he turns around and comes over the top. It's like maybe when you've been in a situation where you like yelled at somebody or you got mad at somebody and you thought they're gonna like submit to you, but they came over the top double as hard at you, and you're like, oh man. Like that must have been what it's like here. Like Peter thought he was making some statement, and Jesus turns around and rebukes him in front of everybody. And he rebukes him in this funniest way. He says, "Get behind me, Satan," referring to Peter as Satan now. Now, we don't like really believe that. I mean, obviously he didn't think Peter was Satan. He knows that. That's not true. What's going on here is that Jesus is saying, Peter, you are lining yourself up with the evil one right now. Why? For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Just crazy. What would it have been like to be in that moment? Oh man, what would it have been like to be Peter? But it's such a good reminder for us that in the midst of a moment, we can go from having this great moment with God, this epiphany moment, you're the Christ, first person ever recognize it. And in many ways, Peter was setting his mind on the things of God. He was recognizing the truth of God. But then in a split second, he was no longer thinking about the things of God. He was thinking about his own, with his human reasoning. No, this will never happen to you. But Jesus is like, no, this is exactly what God has planned. And so, anyway, it's a reminder to me to be diligent to keep my mind on the things of God. Calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, this is beautiful, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. I love that he's talking about a cross, and he hasn't been killed on the cross yet. They didn't know how he's going to be killed, although he just told them he's going to be killed right here. And so, this is probably his foreshadowing right here. But I don't know whether they knew it or not, but a cross is a torture device. It's a horrible way to die. You actually didn't die from the piercing and the blood loss. You died from suffocation, from hanging there, and you would stoop down and hardly be able to breathe, and then you'd push up on your feet that have nails in them, and you'd take a breath, and then you'd sink back down again, and eventually you had no more strength, and you would suffocate. And so this is a radical thing that Jesus is saying. Deny yourself, take up your torture device, and follow him. And he goes on to say, whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel, the good news' sake, will do what? Will save it. And he explains, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of the Father with the holy angels. I mean, that's pretty real right there. Are you ashamed? If we're not ashamed of him, he won't be ashamed of us. If we're proud of him, if we live for him, if we declare him, we recognize he really is God, therefore I'm not going to bow down to anything else, I stand for him primarily, then He's going to stand with us. If we are ashamed of him and we deny him, he's going to deny us. I mean, it's clear. And so, if ever there's a challenge, if ever there's a section that is practical and moving and like, come on, let's do this thing, it's that we would deny ourselves, take up our cross and follow him, that we would not be ashamed, that we would live for him, we really believe this thing and live for this thing. I hope that you will, because he's real and he's worth it, and eternal joy awaits us. God stepped out of heaven and came to us. It's the least we can do to give our life back to him. It's so worth it. So whoever you are, however you ended up watching this video, thank you for joining. Please consider Jesus the Savior of the world. He's worthy of your whole life. I'll plan on hopefully seeing you again tomorrow in chapter 9. God bless.